I was 60 years old, leaner than most men half my age, and I genuinely believed that made me different, not just fitter, different, special in a way that mattered. While I was planning where Malee and I would travel next, she was spending every single Wednesday afternoon with the man she'd supposedly left behind 2 years before I arrived in her life. Every week. Like clockwork. Like I didn't exist. My name is Harold Pierce. I'm Australian. I'm 60 years old. I run 6 days a week. I do strength training 4 mornings a week. And I track my macros with the obsessive precision of someone who is deeply, pathologically afraid of becoming old. I know that about myself now. I didn't know it then. Or maybe I knew it and refused to name it, which is its own kind of cowardice. I came to Chiang Mai on a remote working arrangement 18 months ago. I do digital consulting for 3 firms back in Sydney, which means I can live anywhere with reliable internet and a reasonable time zone overlap. I'd spent time in Thailand before, short holidays in my 50s when my marriage was dissolving and I needed somewhere warm and uncomplicated. When the divorce finalized and my kids were grown and I had no structural reason to stay in a city that had stopped feeling like home, I decided to make the move permanent, or at least semi-permanent. Open-ended, which I told myself was the same as adventurous. I met Malee in October, not in a bar, not through a dating app, which I want to be clear about because it matters to the story I told myself. I met her at a coffee shop near Nimman Road where I worked most mornings. She was a university student, 24 years old, studying education. She sat at the table next to mine for 3 consecutive mornings before we spoke. The conversation started because she asked about the book I was reading. Within 30 minutes I knew her name, her course, her home village 2 hours north of the city, and the fact that she made the best cow soie outside of her grandmother's kitchen. She was warm and funny and entirely unintimidated by me, which I found electrifying in a way I hadn't expected. I want to be precise about what I felt in those early months, because it matters for understanding how comprehensively I failed to see what was directly in front of me. I felt young. Not younger, not rejuvenated in some vague middle-aged man on holiday way. I felt genuinely, structurally, young in a way I hadn't felt in over a decade. My ex-wife and I had grown into something functional and exhausted, and eventually nothing at all. With Malee, I felt chosen in a way that bypassed every reasonable alarm in my body. She would reach for my hand in public without calculation. She laughed at things I said before I'd finished saying them. She asked about my consulting work with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and remembered details between conversations. I was aware, somewhere below the surface, that she was 36 years younger than me. I was aware that people looking at us from the outside would see something familiar and potentially embarrassing. I chose not to live in that awareness. By December, we were spending 4 or 5 nights a week together, alternating between my apartment near Nimman and her place, a small room she shared with a university friend closer to the campus. By January, she had a key to my apartment. By February, we had discussed, in vague but serious terms, what it would mean for her to move in after her semester ended in April. I told my daughter back in Melbourne about her in February. That is the level of commitment I had reached. I was 60 years old. I had been in Chiang Mai for 6 months, and I was telling my adult daughter about a 24-year-old Thai woman, as if this was not a sentence that deserved scrutiny. My fatal flaw, the one I can name clearly now and couldn't name then, was that I had made my physical condition load-bearing in my sense of self. I ran before dawn because stopping felt like dying. I refused to eat badly because eating badly felt like surrender. I was 60 and I could run 10 kilometers, and I genuinely believed this meant something profound about who I was and what I deserved. I thought my fitness made the age gap irrelevant. I thought it made me different from other men my age who came to Thailand and made fools of themselves. I was fit. I was conscious. I was self-aware. I was going to be the exception. I was not the exception. The first change I noticed was the phone. This would have been mid-March, about 5 months into the relationship, and it was subtle enough that I didn't register it consciously for 2 or 3 weeks. Malee had never been secretive about her phone. She'd leave it on the table between us during meals. She'd hand it to me to show me a photo. She'd fall asleep with it on the pillow and not think about it. Then, gradually, it moved. face down on the table instead of face up, taken into the bathroom during her shower when it had previously sat on the counter, slipped into her bag when I approached the desk where she was sitting. I noticed these things the way you notice a slightly different smell in a room, not with alarm, just with a faint registration that something had shifted. I told myself she was probably dealing with something private, a family situation, university stress. I told myself I had no right to surveil her phone, and the instinct to do so was possessive and ugly. I told myself that I trusted her, and that trust required not interrogating every change in behavior. These were all reasonable things to tell myself. I told myself all of them with considerable force because somewhere below the reasoning I already knew something was wrong, and I was not ready to know it consciously. Around the same time, her Wednesdays became strange. She had a class on Wednesday mornings, which she'd mentioned early in the semester, and I'd never thought much about it. But I started to notice that Wednesday afternoons were unavailable in a way that didn't have a consistent explanation. One week she was helping a friend move apartments. The next week, she was visiting her mother's cousin who was briefly in the city. The week after that, she had extra study sessions before an assessment. Each explanation was plausible. Each explanation was different. I was triangulating these variations and dismissing the pattern they formed. I remember a specific Wednesday in late March. She'd told me she was spending the afternoon at the university library before meeting her study group for dinner. I texted her around 4 in the afternoon to ask if she wanted me to cook something for when she got home. The reply came 45 minutes later, which was unusual for her. She was normally fast. She said the study session was running long and she'd grab something on the way. I didn't think much of it, or I thought about it for 20 minutes and then went for a run and thought about it for another 45 minutes while running, which is what I did with things I wasn't ready to confront directly. She had mentioned a name to me in February, casually, in passing, Arthit. She'd referred to him as a friend from her village, someone she'd known since they were children, someone who occasionally passed through Chiang Mai for work. She mentioned him perhaps 3 times in February and March, always lightly, always in the context of a group dynamic. He was mentioned the way you mention a background figure in a story, not a central character. I registered the name without interest. I had no reason to be interested in it. A friend of mine, an expat named Graham who'd been in Chiang Mai for 4 years and knew the city and its dynamics considerably better than I did, said something to me in April that I dismissed instantly and thought about every single day for the next 2 months. We were having coffee and he asked, with studied casualness, whether Malee and I were doing well. I said we were great. He nodded. Then he said, and I remember this precisely, "You know, the expat forums here have a kind of information network. People post things. Not always reliable, but sometimes." I said I didn't follow expat forums and didn't intend to. He said, "Right," and changed the subject. I was irritated with him for the rest of the morning. I told myself he was the kind of cynical, long-term expat who'd been burned once and couldn't stand to see anyone else optimistic. I told myself my situation was different. That phrase again, different. My left knee had been bothering me through April, a recurring runner's issue that occasionally flared badly enough to interrupt my training. I had a physio appointment one Tuesday afternoon that ran long, and I finished an hour earlier than expected. I drove back to my apartment rather than going to the cafe, where I'd planned to work for another 2 hours. I wasn't trying to catch anyone doing anything. I was tired, and my knee was aching, and I wanted to be in my own space. Malee had a key and occasionally came to my apartment between her classes, and I noticed as I came up the corridor that my door was not fully latched. I had left it locked that morning. I was certain of it. I stood in the corridor for probably 15 seconds. I am not being dramatic when I say time changed texture in that moment. Everything slowed and sharpened simultaneously. I could hear a conversation inside, 2 voices, a male voice and Malee's voice, speaking in Thai, not loudly, just normally, the way you talk in a space you feel comfortable in. My hand was on the door handle and I want to tell you I was calm, but my hand was shaking, which I noticed with a kind of detached interest. I registered the sensation of my hand shaking and filed it separately from the act of opening the door. They were in the living room, sitting on the sofa, close together, not in a state of undress, which my brain seized on immediately as evidence that maybe this was fine, maybe this was innocent, maybe this was a friend from the village passing through the city. Then I looked at the scene correctly. His hand was on her knee. They were leaning into each other. Her face when she looked up at me was not the face of someone caught doing something innocent. It was a face I'd never seen on her before, a stripped, momentarily truthful face before she reassembled it into something else. His name was Arthit. He was, I later confirmed, 26 years old. He was from her village. They had been together, I subsequently learned through sources I will describe, for approximately 3 years before she started at university. He was not, as she had casually presented him in February, a childhood friend who occasionally passed through for work. He was the person she had been with for 3 years before me, and had not, in any functional sense, left. I stood in my own doorway. I am not sure how long I stood there. There is a ceiling fan in my living room that makes a faint clicking sound on one rotation, a sound I normally don't notice, and I stood there counting the clicks because my brain needed something concrete to count. At some point I said his name out loud. I said Arthit as a statement rather than a question, and I watched her face do something complicated. He stood up. He said something in Thai to her that I didn't understand. He was not, I want to note, aggressive or frightened or apologetic. He was simply a young Thai man in a situation that was probably not the first time he'd been in it, and he handled it with a composure I found, in retrospect, somehow more devastating than anger would have been. She said his name back to him, and then looked at me and said, "Harold, I explain, not I can explain, just I explain." Her English thinned when she was frightened, which I had noticed before in minor situations and found endearing. It was not endearing now. I said, "How long?" She said he was just visiting. I said, "How long, Malee?" There was a pause that contained approximately everything. Then she said, "We talk sometimes." He left. I don't know what passed between them in the moment I stepped aside from the doorway to let him out. I was looking at my coffee table, at a coffee ring stain I'd been meaning to clean, at nothing, at something I needed to look at instead of the doorway. After he left, there was a silence in the apartment that had a specific weight, the silence of a story that has just ended its pretense of being something else. What came out over the next 2 hours was partial, revised, partial again, and probably still incomplete. She had not ended things with Arthit when she began spending time with me. She had told herself, she said, that she would, that it would happen naturally, that I was a farang and would leave eventually, and it wouldn't matter. Then it had continued longer than she expected. Then she had feelings for both of us simultaneously, which she expressed with a phrasing that sounded translated, the way emotions sometimes do when they're being rendered in a second language under duress. She said he was there first, which was delivered not as a cruelty but as a factual statement, though it landed as both. I asked if the Wednesday afternoons were him. She said yes. I did the arithmetic on 10 months and arrived at approximately 40 Wednesdays, 40 visits. 40 afternoons in which I had been working in a cafe or going for a run or cooking dinner expecting her home, and Arthit had been in the city. I don't know whether he knew about me. I never asked, and I never will. I asked about the phone. She said she changed the password in March because she was worried I would see his messages, which was accurate, which was also the moment she made a deliberate choice to continue. Not a passive drift, but an active protection of the arrangement. I want to be clear about that distinction, because I spent a long time trying to make her deception smaller by removing her agency from it. And she had agency. She tried crying. This is not a cruel thing to say about her. It's an observation about crisis behavior. The tears came in stage 3, after the initial careful admissions. And they were real tears, I believe, because by that point the situation was genuinely distressing for everyone in the room. But they arrived at the precise moment when I needed clarity rather than emotion, and I felt them as a kind of weather, real but not relevant. I asked her to leave. She said, "Harold, please." I said, "Please take your things and leave." She left her toothbrush. I found it the next morning. I don't know why that detail stayed with me, but it did. The mundane residue of a life that had been occurring in my apartment, her toothbrush in my bathroom, and everything it stood for about what I had believed was real. After she left, I sat on my sofa for a period of time I can't accurately estimate and did nothing. Not crying, not thinking, not planning, nothing. My phone was on the coffee table and I looked at it and didn't pick it up for what must have been an hour. Then I called Graham. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been half expecting the call, and when I told him what had happened there was a pause before he said anything. The pause of a man choosing between "I told you" and something kinder. He chose something kinder, which I appreciated. He came over. We drank whiskey that I normally wouldn't touch because I don't drink during training blocks, and that night I drank 3 glasses and didn't care about the training block. He told me, carefully, that Arthit was known. Not famous, not notorious, just known in the way that people become known in the information ecosystem of expat communities in mid-sized Thai cities, where people talk and accumulate data and occasionally post warnings on forums that other people occasionally read. Malee's relationship with him had been common knowledge in certain circles. Not to me. To certain circles? I remembered Graham's comment in April about expat forums and information networks. I had been so committed to the idea that my situation was different that I had received a direct warning and converted it, in real time, into evidence of my own superior judgment. That is the precise mechanism of the delusion I was living in. Information arrived and I processed it into confirmation of what I wanted to believe. In the weeks after I found them, I did what the betrayed mind does, which is reconstruct. I went back through 10 months of memories and recontextualized them with what I now knew. The time she'd come home from her Wednesdays with a slightly different energy, more tired or more distracted, which I had attributed to study stress. The evening in January when she'd seemed reluctant to stay over and invented a reason about an early morning class, and I had driven her home and kissed her goodbye and driven back to my empty apartment, feeling like a man in a relationship rather than a man in a convenience. The new jacket she'd mentioned buying herself in March, which I had not thought about since, and which I now found myself wondering about with a specificity that helped nothing. Was any of it real? Is the question I kept arriving at and couldn't answer. I believe the accurate answer is that it was partially real, genuinely complicated, not simply a performance. I don't think she felt nothing for me. I think she felt something for me and something for him simultaneously and managed the logistics of that for 10 months with a competence I found, once I could see it clearly, actually quite impressive in a way that made everything worse. She was not a cartoon villain. She was a 24-year-old woman navigating a circumstance she'd created and grown and not been willing to resolve. That doesn't excuse the 40 Wednesdays. It just makes the story harder to hold on to cleanly. I stayed in Chiang Mai for 6 weeks after. I want to be honest about why. Partly because I wasn't ready to concede the city, partly because I'd signed a 6-month lease extension in January like an idiot, and partly because running 6 kilometers through Chiang Mai at dawn is still one of the better things in my life, and I wasn't going to surrender it to embarrassment. I saw her once, at a distance, near the university. She was with friends and didn't see me. I went home and did 200 push-ups and hated every one of them. I moved to Pai for 2 months, which is small and quiet and does not have the density of memory that Chiang Mai had developed for me. I'm back in Chiang Mai now, in a different apartment, in a different neighborhood. I run different routes. I don't know if she's still with Arthit. I don't know if she has another Farang in her life. I don't know, and I've had to practice not wanting to know, which is its own kind of discipline. What I learned, and I mean specifically learned, not the vague wisdom that looks good at the end of a cautionary story, but actual operational knowledge. A name that comes up 3 times in 2 months as a village friend is not a village friend. I knew his name for 4 months before I understood what it meant. The information was present. I chose not to interrogate it because interrogating it meant risking what I had, and I wasn't ready to risk it. The phone is the instrument of a secret life. When it moves, when it changes its relationship to your shared space, something has changed in the relationship itself. I am not saying surveillance is the answer. I am saying that when the phone goes from the pillow to the locked bathroom, the phone knows something you don't yet. My fitness had nothing to do with anything. I want to say this plainly and without self-pity. I am 60 years old. I can run 10 kilometers. I do chin-ups. I track my protein. None of that made the age gap a non-factor. None of that made me more comprehensible to a 24-year-old woman with a 3-year relationship behind her and a village history I would never have access to. I built my physical condition into an argument for why the obvious dynamics didn't apply to me, and the obvious dynamics applied to me completely. The expat information network exists for a reason. I refused it because accepting it meant accepting that I was a recognizable type, the older Western man in Thailand who believes his love story is unique. My story was not unique. Graham knew that. The forums knew that. I was the only one who didn't know it, and that was a choice I made repeatedly for months. The warning signs I rationalized away were not subtle. Wednesday afternoons, a name repeated, a phone that moved, vague explanations that varied. These are not ambiguous signals that require sophisticated interpretation. They are direct information. I received them and filed them as noise because I was afraid of what signal they were carrying. When Graham tried to tell me, in his careful, plausible deniability way, I became irritated at him. If someone you trust tries to tell you something about your partner, and you find yourself defending the partner before you've heard the evidence, listen to yourself more carefully in that moment. The defensiveness is the information. I am not angry at Malee in the way I expected to be angry. That surprised me when I found it. There is something in me that understands her situation as one she mismanaged, rather than cynically designed, though I acknowledge that distinction matters more to my own peace than to the practical reality of what she did. What I am, more than angry, is tired of who I was for those 10 months. The man who ran before dawn and ate his macros and believed his fitness immunized him against ordinary human foolishness. He was exhausting to be. I don't miss him. If you're reading this from somewhere in the middle of a situation that sounds familiar, I want to say something directly to you. Not from bitterness, but from the specific clarity that comes from the other side of this particular experience. If her phone has a new password it didn't have before, that password is protecting something from you. If there is a name that comes up casually and repeatedly, that name is not casual. If one afternoon a week has a different quality, a different texture of explanation, a different energy when she comes home, that afternoon is an afternoon you are not included in. Your gut knows. It is telling you already. The question is whether you're going to keep talking yourself out of it because the alternative is knowing something that will cost you something you're not ready to lose. You can't run far enough, or fast enough, or lift enough weight to make yourself the exception to a pattern that has been running longer than you've been in the country. Sometimes I wonder if she ever loved me. Then I think about 40 Wednesdays and I understand that whatever she felt, it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't the thing I was operating as though I had. And I think maybe that's the thing I needed to learn most, that insufficient love is its own specific category, not the same as no love, but also not the thing it was claiming to be. It wears the same clothes and speaks the same language and lives in your apartment and has a key to your door, and it's still not the thing you think you have. She left her toothbrush. I threw it away eventually. Took me longer than it should have.